Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is Khawaja Hammad Akbar, and you're watching Global Times Pakistan. And today I have with me Mr. Michael Kugelman. He is the Deputy Director, Asia Programs at Wilson Center, United States of America. And today the topic we are discussing with him is the Pakistan-US relations, the next chapter. What would be the next chapter? So, Michael, how you see the in current environment of tension, Pakistan-US relations?
It's interesting. First of all, thank you for having me for this discussion. Before this political crisis in Pakistan, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship had been in a very unsettled, uncertain state. As you know, I'm sure, for many years here in Washington, there's a tendency to look at the relationship with Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan. And ever since U.S. troops left Afghanistan and essentially Washington set Afghanistan in the rearview mirror, it was a bit unclear what direction the U.S.-Pakistan relationship would take. There had been some exploratory negotiations about new forms of security cooperation focused on countering terrorism in Afghanistan, but I don't think those negotiations really got anywhere. So, the relationship was not in crisis. It was fairly stable, but it was unsettled. And of course, what has happened in recent days with the political crisis and the allegations coming from Imran Khan about U.S. interference and conspiracies, obviously that's going to set the relationship back. There's no doubt about that. But I think that the trajectory of the relationship moving forward will really depend a lot on what the next government in Pakistan looks like. I imagine that if Imran Khan were to return to power, it would be more difficult to return the relationship to equilibrium. But we could go into this. Even with all these problems in the relationship, that doesn't mean that it will collapse, because there's always quiet areas of cooperation playing out in the relationship, even when you have all of these tensions in the diplomatic and the political front. So there is still hope to salvage the relationship.
Thank you. Michael, how you assess personally that Imran Khan has accused the American government, particularly West? Initially, he didn't name anyone, but after some time in his address to parliamentarians, he named the Assistant Secretary of State, Donald Lu, as the person who informed or threatened the Pakistan's ambassador, Mr. Asad Majid. How you see this development and this narrative and of Imran Khan government?
Well, you're right that Imran Khan's decision to make public the name of this U.S. official, I think that was another blow to the relationship with the U.S. I mean, it's bad enough for the relationship when Imran Khan accuses the U.S. of trying to overthrow him, when there's, in my view, no evidence that was the case. But then for him to come out and essentially make public the name of a U.S. official who had been having a private conversation with the then Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. certainly would not be received well here. And this is, of course, I think, such a great case study in the volatility of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. For sure, I know that many in Pakistan would understandably be very suspicious of the exchange that Donald Lu allegedly had with Ambassador Khan, thinking that all of these very negative, critical things he said about Imran Khan and all his talk about how there would need to be changes if Imran Khan survives a no confidence vote. I could understand how many Pakistanis would think that that's one reflection of an intent to actually try to overthrow Khan, just because of the history. I don't need to explain to you and to your listeners that there is a past history of U.S. meddling in the relationship. But here in Washington, where this allegation has been met with widespread disbelief and even bemusement, it's a sense that here we go again, of Pakistan trying to drag America into its domestic politics. It certainly doesn't help the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. That's the view here in Washington. So you've got that clash of views that I think is so common with the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And you've got two different sides of the story, two different narratives. And I think that, quite frankly, US officials would rather not really say anything else about this whole incident, wait till it blows over, wait until there's a new government in place. And at that point, maybe try to try to get things back to where they were. But it's a big blow to the relationship.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, you must have read the statement that came out from a representative of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they called it this interference, alleged interference, as the shameless interference. And how you see this statement? Should Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has intervened or interfered in this matter?
I'm actually not surprised that the Russian government intervened. I mean, we know that the state of the U.S.-Russia relationship is a total disaster given what's going on. So it's not surprising that Moscow would want to jump into the fray and try to, take the side of whoever is going against the United States here. And, of course, a big part of this story is indeed Imran Khan's visit to Moscow. I mean, we know that. I mean, that's what had been a focus of this conversation between Ambassador Khan and Donald Lu, and clearly there were U.S. officials that were not happy that he made the visit. So Russia is at least indirectly a part of this controversy, and I think that
Michael,
it serves as an opportunity.
Whenever this comes to the best of my experience and my knowledge, I believe that Russia should not have done that, because Pakistan, by doing this, Russia has given us the impression that its relations are with Pakistan are not state-to-state relations, but a state-to Khan relation. How you see and how you will answer this question? Because this is what I am getting an impression from this.
Well, you're right. I mean, I think that it's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, at this point in time, Pakistan is clearly trying to take a very neutral position on the war in Ukraine and Russia's activities. Pardon me. That had been the position of the government, of the Imran Khan government. Of course, we heard the army chief give a very different take, where he seemed to come down very hard on Russia. He condemned the invasion as an aggression. He said it can't happen and so on. But I think that, broadly speaking, Pakistan would like to sort of stay above the fray and be seen as a neutral entity in this. And indeed, it's true that by injecting itself into this whole thing, it does indeed come across that Russia is trying to sort of amplify and emphasize its growing relationship with Pakistan. But you turn that around, I think that if you look at this strictly from the sake of the bilateral Pakistan-Russia relationship, I think there is widespread support to deepen that relationship. I mean, I think there's a genuine interest in deepening that relationship because of the potential for cooperation, though it's going to be difficult to work commercially with Russia with the sanctions regime now. So I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing for Pakistan if it wants to signal to the world that it does have a real growing relationship with Russia. But indeed, from the perspective of the geopolitics of it, of the Ukraine crisis and Pakistan wanting to stay neutral, in that case, it doesn't send a good signal.
Thank you. And you mentioned the Chief of Army Staff, General Javed Bajwa, in a few days back at Islamabad Security Dialogue. He actually mentioned and acknowledged the fact that United States is the largest exporter of our goods. So, so how you see that? Because Imran Khan is accusing United States of America, and General Javed Bajwa is acknowledging the United States being the largest trade partner of Pakistan. How you understand or how you see this divided policy of Pakistan?
Well, I think 2 points on that front. One, I mean, it's quite well known now that there has been a rift between Imran Khan and the army chief that's been developing in recent months, especially since Imran Khan objected to how the army chief was handling the process to bring in the next intelligence chief. And that continued in the months that followed. And so I think on one level, this is political in the sense that the army chief wanted to sort of separate himself from Imran Khan to distance himself from these allegations that Khan was making about a U.S. conspiracy. And the army chief wanted to say, well, no, we actually value our relationships with the U.S. We want to continue on that front. The second point is more geopolitical, foreign policy based. My sense is that in recent years, the military in Pakistan has been more receptive to the idea of continued and deepening partnership with the U.S. than the civilian leadership had been, which had been led by Imran Khan, who, has long been a sharp critic of U.S. policy in the region. And, the reality of the situation is that military to military relations have been a big part of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship for many years. And I think this is not a good thing for democracy in Pakistan, but the United States has tended to privilege its relations with military interlocutors over civilian interlocutors. And there's been all this talk about how Joe Biden was not willing to pick up the phone and call Imran Khan. There have been plenty of high-level phone calls and conversations between senior U.S. officials and senior Pakistani military officials, including the army chief. So that's how I see that. It's both a political and a geopolitical / foreign policy dynamic at play here.
Don't you think that Imran Khan and Mr. Donald Lu has created actually a problem and a challenging situation for the coming government in Pakistan with respect to the relationship with United States of America? This will be challenging because whatever government will come in power in Pakistan will have to normalize or will have to initiate the talks with United States, and it will actually give a perception and generate a perception in public that United States was actually involved in toppling down the Khan government.
Well, indeed. Of course, it depends on what happens. I mean, if we do have elections, and if PTI were to return, Imran Khan were to return, that would be one dynamic. As I said, that would make it tough to restore equilibrium to the relationship. But if the next government is not led by Imran Khan, not led by the PTI, then indeed that's another type of challenge for the relationship that I think would be more prominent on the Pakistan side, because indeed, public sentiment is such that there's clearly, understandably, going to be a lot of unhappiness about these comments that that Donald Lu reportedly made. And many will believe that there was a U.S. attempt to overthrow Imran Khan, suggesting that indeed, as you suggest, if you do get a new government that's not led by Khan, that indirectly that must have had something to do with something that the U.S. had done. And that would make it very politically risky for the next government in Pakistan to try to reset the relationship with Washington. But again, as I said before, there are different channels to the relationship. There's the formal, there's the civilian aspect of it. There's also the military to military aspect of it. And that would not be as impacted by the volatilities going on with politics and domestic politics. But absolutely, on a broad level, no matter how things shake out, no matter what the next government in Pakistan looks like, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship will face challenges, given, and not just because of what we had just discussed, but also, the existing challenges with the relationship that I mentioned earlier about there needing to be a new base or anchor for the relationship, and also the inherent geopolitical constraints in that, each country here is deepening relations with the other's top rival. U.S. is expanding its relations with India. Pakistan is deepening its already extensive relations with China. That makes things tough as well.
Thank you. Lastly, not lastly, second last, my second last question to you would be why it is so easy to believe that America is involved in internal political situation or internal political scenarios of our country. Why people buy this narrative so much? Because in Pakistan, whenever you say America is involved, America has remained so much involved in the country that people don't hesitate in believing that they're involved. So how you feel about it, that America shouldn't stop adopting the policy of interference in internal political affairs of other countries?
Well, I think that these allegations of U.S., these allegations of U.S. meddling and U.S. conspiracies, this is an example of conspiratorial thinking that is rooted in some truth. I think that's important to acknowledge that, you just have to go back a decade to look at how the CIA worked with a Pakistani medical doctor to come out with this fake vaccination campaign to help track down bin Laden. That's one of the most prominent recent examples. And then, of course, you had the Raymond Davis affair, which happened just a few months before the whole bin Laden raid. And you go back in time and history, and even when the U.S. and Pakistan were Cold War allies, And then, more recently, when they were purportedly counterterrorism focused allies, there was always U.S. mischief, so to speak. Now, I would argue that things have changed in recent years, especially since U.S. forces left Afghanistan, and the U.S. hasn't had as much skin in the game, so to speak, and the stakes haven't been as high for the U.S. that it would be willing to actually meddle, whether overtly or covertly, in Pakistani domestic politics and try to collude with the opposition to overthrow a sitting government. I don't think that's the case anymore, but because there is so much evidence of what happened in the past, and obviously, I think that because this is America, because this is Pakistan, this history is not going to be forgotten. And these are lessons that are taught in the schools and that have been in the public discourse for so long. I think it's only inevitable that there would be a tendency to assume the worst about U.S. intentions. And as I had said before, that means that many will look at this exchange between Donald Lu and Ambassador Khan and think that, okay, that must be some indication of something even worse that was in the midst. There would not be a tendency to just take it as what I think it was, a case of a U.S. official complaining about a prime minister that he would have personally preferred not be in power anymore, and that's it. So I could totally understand. So I think hopefully that answers your question, just the history at play here and those longstanding perceptions that whatever the U.S. is up to, it must not be good.
So, Michael, lastly, what could be the avenues of cooperation or engagement between U.S. and Pakistan relationship in the next chapter, in your view?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I had said earlier, there's a long history of cooperation continuing very quietly, even when you have all kinds of messy situations elsewhere in the relationship. And this mainly occurs within non-security spaces in terms of, education exchanges, development cooperation, that type of thing. So I think that's where to look. And it's notable that even in the midst of this crisis, just over the last week, you had USAID, which of course is the U.S. Development Agency, announce a new initiative to provide safe drinking water to thousands of people in 2 provinces. The U.S. Embassy in Islamabad about a week ago announced a new partnership with a women's university in Pakistan. And also you had the U.S. Consul General in Karachi, I believe, meet with a group of business leaders there to talk about commercial cooperation. So this was all happening quietly, even as there was all this noise about the conspiracy allegations and so on. And I think that's what we can continue to see. And I think that in turn emphasizes the strength of people-to-people relations between the U.S. and Pakistan, which is a forgotten success story. All these Pakistani students that have come to the United States on Fulbright grants, all of the business exchanges. We have a U.S.-Pakistan Business Council here in Washington that has always been not always, but is typically very active. So you do have major companies investing in Pakistan. So I think that's where we would look, right? So there's not necessarily going to be this much ballyhooed cooperation on the diplomatic front or even on the security front. But I think you have to look at the areas that occupy what I would describe as softer, safer spaces for cooperation.
So you're overruling the area of cooperation in the security domain between Pakistan and US in future.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I wouldn't want to disregard that for sure. And as I had said before, both militaries, I think, would be keen to continue to work together. But I think that there could be limitations unless, quite frankly, as you know, the Trump administration early in its term suspended security aid to Pakistan. And I think unless some or all of that were to be released, I think it may be hard to really move forward on security cooperation. And also, unless there's any type of new agreement for the two to cooperate on counterterrorism in Afghanistan, beyond that, there's really not much space, I think, for security cooperation. Otherwise, it's just sort of tension-based. The U.S. thinking Pakistan has not done enough to combat some of these terror groups in Pakistan that have historically targeted India. Pakistan doesn't agree with that, and that's not an area for cooperation. So that's why, yes, I think that there could be dialogues around security, but in terms of actual substantive cooperation, it may take a while to get back to that.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you, audience.